I'm Julie Latcham. It's lovely to be here this afternoon. It's been a really wonderful experience having an article in the York Policy Review. I think it looks beautiful. It was a wonderful experience. It went through with minor corrections straight away, which is unusual for a start. And amazingly, it's had all sorts of social media interactions, been a lot of work gone on, but it's probably, I think, for me, probably one of my most read paper, and that's extraordinary. You go to lots of effort to get all these publications with massive impact factor stuff, and of course no one ever reads it. And this has actually been wonderful, and it's had lots of reads. So thank you very much for making that happen and for inviting me to submit something. And I think that invitation came a little bit off the back of a conversation I'd had with Jill when I was I was literally midway in collecting my data, and I'd had quite an emotional time.
Don't let the demon put you off, will you?
Oh, no, not at all, it's fine. And Jill had phoned me because we were talking about ethnographic research, and Celia knew what I was doing, and she said, phone Julie and have a chat. Poor Jill, she didn't realise what she was in for, because I was in the middle of data collection and I was in pieces, so I spent most of the time crying down the phone. Amazingly, she's still talking to me and thought I was okay, so that's really nice to know. So this afternoon, what I want to talk to you about is my own experiences of conducting an ethnography in 2 rehabilitation settings in the independent sector. I'm going to focus on talking about access to participation and involvement of people with severe brain injuries who do not have the capacity to consent. I know there's a lot of the phrase in the Mental Capacity Act is, lack capacity to consent. But I've got this thing rolling around in my head. There's a professor at Cardiff University who does work with young people. And in the legislation around looked after children and young people, there's a lot of lack language. And she has this piece of video which screams lack at you, and it flashes up all of the legislation which talks about, therefore, what they don't have rather than what they offer and can provide. And so I was suddenly feeling very conscious about using lacking capacity, so I'm ending up saying don't have capacity. I'm not sure if that's much better, but nonetheless. And I want to reflect on the positives of being a hybrid researcher, and what I mean by that is that I'm a clinician by background, and I'm now a social science researcher, and maybe what my clinical status has done to help me involve people who lack capacity, do not have capacity in my research. So I'm a physiotherapist, a neurophysiotherapist by background. I've worked in the NHS and in the independent sector, so I've been a team leader of general and old age medicine across 2 acute hospitals in Gloucestershire. I've led a multidisciplinary therapy team in neurorehabilitation long-term care, and at one stage I was a matron of a 60-bedded neuro unit, again in the independent sector. So I've written a few bits and pieces. My golden thread through my research is always neurological care or rehabilitation or something that relates to people with neurological conditions, but of late my work has begun to focus on brain injury. So I'm just at the end of my PhD, and I'm hoping to submit my thesis on Wednesday. So part of the sort of state of me is related to that. But it has been largely a wonderful journey, and I'm glad to be able to talk about it almost in past tense. So my PhD posed 2 questions. I asked, how are the futures of people with brain injury shaped and negotiated through day-to-day interaction and organisational process and practice? And I asked, what role does time, play and the future hold in the development and mediation of relationships between patients with brain injuries, their families and healthcare professionals during rehabilitation? What I did was a dual-centred ethnography. So I spent 5 months in 2 neuro-rehab settings in the independent sector, observing day-to-day goings-on. I interviewed people with severe brain injury, their families and healthcare professionals on top of that, and in some instances I did what I called close observations, which were literally sit by the bedside and follow people for a block of 2 hours at a time. For a subset of people that I encountered. Both of my sites were independent settings, so rehabilitation centres that sit outside of the NHS. So I included people who don't have capacity to consent in my research, and the motivations for that were, well, first off, it was practical. My study was about people with severe brain injuries, and if you're really going to mean that, then that is going to include people who do not have capacity to consent. I had in my mind that I wanted in some way to be able to research and be around people in a disorder of consciousness as part of that subset of people with brain injury, and these are people who can largely not consistently express any kind of wish or communicate consistently in any way, and they would most definitely lack capacity to consent. So working back from them as a group of people who I would include, that straight away put me into a situation where I would be looking at including people who lacked capacity. I knew that observations were going to be really critical to what I was trying to get at in my research, and knowing the type of setting that I was going to, as soon as you walk through the door, there are people. And those people, some of which will not have capacity to consent. So instantly, as soon as I'm in there, that's going to be a situation that I'm faced with if I'm going to research in these ways. Of course, there was the moral and ethical ideas of there's nothing about me without me. How could I possibly do a project about people with severe brain injury and not think about including everyone that entailed? That was not justifiable to me. I also realised that if I was going to include people with severe brain injury, hopefully me with some clinical skills, 10 years of neurological care experience, that I might actually be able to do that and hopefully do that relatively well. So it was something I really wanted to try and achieve. So I had to think, okay, if I was going to include people who didn't have capacity to consent, and I was including people with a wide range of impairments, what was it that I was going to do to maximise their inclusion and maximise participation? Well, first, to maximise inclusion, I needed to get ethical approval. That would help. So that was going to be something that was high on the list. What else I could do was think about the methods I might choose and to find an approach that might work with that. So I could have maybe thought about focus groups, I could have thought about interviews, I could have thought about different types of observations and many other things. Eventually I ended up with semi-structured interviews and ethnographic observations, as that was a way of kind of including almost everybody. When it came to interviews, however, how I would go about that would definitely not suit everybody if I just chose one method. The reality is you're communicating with people with really severe injuries who may, for example, only be able to communicate maybe with eye blinking, or might use various communication tools, or might only communicate spatially, for example, in terms of needs and wishes. One thing was never going to work for everybody. So I decided I would take an individual approach. So I would attempt to do some form of semi-structured interview, whatever that ended up looking like, including any methodological and communication tools that was needed for the person. Luckily, academically, that had already been discussed, and it's called a case-by-case approach, which was really helpful because I didn't have to justify that. It was already written and tested, and it works very well. So, I don't know how many people here have got ethical approval to include people in ethnographic research who do not have capacity to consent, but it's a very big form. It's a huge form. It's the same as NHS ethics. So I went through the Social Care Research Ethics Committee, which in a sense is through the IRAS system. It's exactly the same set of forms, and you have to go in front of the panel and you do all of these things, and it's pretty much the same. The only thing you don't have is R&D, which is great. So in terms of maximising your chance of success if you are going to apply, Jill mentioned earlier, and set really nicely, about paying attention to section 30 to 34. This is the section in the Mental Capacity Act that talks about research and how to include people. Amazingly now, since things have transferred across to the Health Research Authority, they now have some really useful advice and toolkits. The thing that I felt that really helped me in terms of gaining ethical approval was my hybrid status. I really wrote to that in my application, talking about how through my clinical skills and my clinical observations, it would give me a bit of a head start, in being able to communicate and being able to recognise some of the way in which people with severe brain injuries might interact. There's a professor at Cardiff called Adam Hedgecoe who talks a lot about how you have to gain confidence from ethics committee panels. For me, part of writing my own skills into that was about getting the panel to feel confident that I was an okay person to take this type of research forward. I mean, what I was applying to do included things, very personal observations, literally sat by bedsides watching personal care, really up close and personal stuff, and to be the type of person that was going to manage that well enough, they're going to have some confidence in you. So you certainly need to be very clear and in a way, confident in what you're putting in that application. One other main tip about applying for ethical approval in these situations, find someone who's already applied and ask them for their forms. They might smart at it, but it's really helpful just in some of the things that might get in your way. So things like when you look at these big forms, you're not even sure what some of the basic information is. So what does it mean about which host, what's the host institution, what's this, what's that, what's the other? All of those things get wiped out of the way if you're looking at someone else's forms. You know that's all right already. In terms of phrasing, things like that, the way in which things can be written, that can be very helpful. And also it will give you, these text boxes are free text boxes. You've got no idea how long it should be or how short it should be or how much detail you need to give if you've got someone else's form that's gone through an approval process, and you get an idea of how much detail you need to give. The one other thing, which I think is the best bit of advice I can give you if you're thinking about doing it, is don't even start writing ethics forms or even thinking about it unless you've written a thorough research proposal. And when I say thorough, I mean the sort of 10,000 word proposal. Because if you've written that, you just pull it out and dump it if it's written well enough and you know where you're going. If you start not knowing anything about your methods or really thinking it through greatly, it'll be really, really hard to get through the form. So do that first. You'll have to submit it as a research proposal anyway. Is part of your ethics process, but that just makes life a little bit easier, and then you will feel you have some momentum through the form because it's 80 pages long or whatever it is. I'll try and sound more positive later. Luckily, I did get ethics approval, and because I got ethics approval in the way that I got it, it meant that I spent 400 hours of observation. And that meant that I was doing those observations broadly around 60 people with severe brain injury, many who didn't have capacity to consent. It meant that I managed to get specific involvement of 8 people with severe brain injury without capacity to consent. 4 I could interview because they had some way of communicating consistently, and 4 who didn't have that, but I could closely observe them, and they formed a huge part of my thesis. That meant that I could get behind doors and I could be at the bedside as well as out and about, so I could be with them almost all the time. I also interviewed families. I had 9 family members that I interviewed, and I interviewed 59 staff members. What that led to was a beautiful, rich data set, even if I say so myself, and probably one of the best times of my life. It was absolutely fantastic. Ethnography is such an amazing thing to do. It really is. To say it's privileged is probably a bit of an odd thing to say, but people's generosity with you as a stranger in a place, and the way in which you get interacted with, and how you build relations over time with people when you're just sat there, you're just the researcher hanging out. It was absolutely amazing. I loved every second of it. So it's worth it. It's worth it for any observation, even the pain of ethics, or at least the pain of the ethics process is so worth it because it's such a fantastic experience to have. So I want to tell you 2 stories about 2 participants. and try and think about what these, well actually there's not two participants, there's one not participant, one participant, and what the experiences with these two people taught me, and how maybe in the way that troubles the way in which, or begs questions of the way in which the MCA is presented currently. So Ria is the woman I write about in the article that's in York Policy Review. Ria was one of a group of about 6 residents who would often be brought into a lounge that I would sit in to do broad observations. So these were always things that were at a distance. So I would start, when I began my ethnography in each of the settings, I would start doing about 3 to 4 weeks of broad observations, which would just mean I was around, but I wasn't interacting directly with residents, because in order to do that I had to go through a process of gatekeeping and of course consenting. Ria would always, however, try and interact with me across the room. And then we're talking almost to the back of the room, over big distances. And she would consistently try and talk to me, or wave at me, or demonstrate to me that she knew I was there. So she was in my mind as one of the potential people that I might want to include in the research. I knew fully well from conversations I had heard and roughly what had happened to her that she would not have the capacity to consent. And therefore, as per the Mental Capacity Act, I was going to be on the look for a personal consultee in the first instance. I knew she had a visitor because I'd spied her. Unfortunately, this, as I found out later, this visitor, A, didn't come very often, was B, very difficult to get hold of, and C, didn't speak English, and I didn't speak her language. In my ethics form, because I was a poor PhD student, I had clearly stated that I would only be able to include people who spoke English or could understand English, or however it was I worded it. And I was very unhappy about that. So I did try and find if there was any possible way of getting maybe some translation, and it just didn't become possible. So I then wondered, well, there is an available consultee in kind of theory, but she's not really accessible. What would a nominated consultee look like? And I started to just think about ways around that. And I was thinking about a nominated consultee for her, and I was talking to people about her. And healthcare professionals could tell me things about Ria. They could tell me her care routines, they could tell me a few bits and pieces. But it was like she'd come with no history. No one really knew her very well, and no one could really tell me anything about her that seemed to have any weight. And I came to the conclusion that Ria was someone that I really didn't feel confident was known well enough to be consulted about in that nominated way. And that kind of really, troubled me, but it was the way it was. And so therefore I kept my distance. She was going to be included in terms of the general background of the broad observations, but that would be that. And so that was that. But towards the end of the time I was at the first site, one day I walked past Ria, and this was the closest physically I'd ever got to her, and she was sat in a wheelchair, and she was turned away from me, and I came, just walked past her to the side. And as I walked past her, she grabbed me like this, exactly like this, and she pulled me right into her face and started talking to me. And I could just about turn to see her as she was holding me here. And after about 5 minutes, I said to her, I'm really uncomfy, I'm going to have to sit down. And she hovered her hands over my arms, just enough to allow me to move, to sit down, but not enough to move away from her. And I sat down, and once I was sat down again, she pulled me in close and she chatted. Now, Ria would chatter in jargon, so I didn't have a clue what she was saying. I could only tell the sort of intonation, but I had no idea what she was saying. It was no doubt mixed in both English and her first language, and plus the jargon on top that you can get with brain injury sometimes. And so she kept going, and eventually a healthcare assistant walked past and said something along the lines of, she's got you now, she won't let you go. And then spoke to Ria and said, why are you talking to her? You don't know her. And Ria, with the absolute face of defiance, looked up at her, almost in slight disgust, looked back at me, stroked my face, pulled me closer, turned away from the healthcare assistant and chatted to me again, and whispering, like she was telling me her deepest, darkest secrets. And this went on for as long as I could stay there, really, and we were having a conversation of a type. So that interaction with Ria just made me think a little bit about this was someone that I couldn't include in my research in any way, of any form where I couldn't get consultation for her. But she clearly wanted to engage with me. And she did that eventually when she got her moment. She captured me the moment she had the opportunity, and she took it. And the way in which the Mental Capacity Act looks at recruitment is that it's researcher-led. Now, Jill talked about earlier about the notion of protection, and of course, in many ways that makes sense. But with recruitment, the idea of it being researcher-led means that in theory was always all about me. In most circumstances, with everyone that was included in my research who had severe brain injury, they made the first move, they interacted with me first. And so in the article, I kind of argue that in a way they self-selected. They came to me, they chose it themselves. So I first have a slight issue around the idea that recruitment can only be one way, because I think there's some way this can, it's certainly more fluid. Second, because in neurocare settings, and probably in others, they're quite specialist, and so patients can be geographically displaced a long way away from their homes in order to receive long-term care, and they can be cared for years and years, decades even. And over time, who they were or anything that was known about them prior to injury, because in most cases these are people who have had a traumatic incident, becomes lost and they aren't known. And what concerns me about the idea of nominated consultation is that, yes, in theory, there might be lots of people who can consult as the way in which the MCA lies out nominated consultation. Are they known well enough? No one has access to their prior expressed values and beliefs. Maybe have some care routines. So I'm not sure, has the MCA actually created this little subsection of people who actually can't be included in research because they are not known well enough? My second story is about the involvement of Donovan. So Donovan was a severely brain injured man, a young man who again did not have capacity to consent. He had a loving family who visited daily, so I had great access to the potential of a personal consultee. I was introduced to Donovan while I was spending some time with staff, kind of following them as part of the ethnography early on. And when I first met Donovan, he was clearly unsure of my presence, and I got a bit of a scowl. I was told that he was nervous of new people, which is absolutely fair enough. But we stood there for a while and we were having a chat and starting to have a little bit of a joke, and it wasn't long before I got a big smile. I thought, okay, maybe he won't mind my presence too much. We'll just kind of see how this goes. So thinking that it might be okay, I spoke to his partner and told her about the research and asked her if she would be the personal consultee, and went through the process, and a few days later she got back to me and she said wholeheartedly he would want to be involved if he could have told you that himself. And there were various reasons for that. And I felt, so in complete contrast to Ria, I felt entirely satisfied that actually his inclusion matched who he was, who he is, and carried on with him. So what she consulted for was for me to spend sets of 2 hours with him, 8 sets of 2 hours, watching whatever was going on around him. And these were relatively random. They weren't timed in any way. They were just kind of what worked. And when I first started to spend time with him, again, he was initially a little bit nervous of my presence, and it took a little while. But within, any time I was with him, within a few minutes or so, he certainly seemed to not be aware of my presence and was concentrating whatever was going on. And that got better and better over time. And over time, I spent more and more time with Donovan, who could not move his arms and legs in any controlled way. didn't move without an instruction. So in any movement, so in terms of, say, physiotherapeutic rehabilitation, and any movement that was trying to be achieved, that was with command. So reach for the glass, raise your hand, give him some weights that had some meaning to him. He would try and use them, but it always came with command. It wasn't volitional very much at all, and that's what was a huge part of rehabilitation, to try and improve his movement. He had no speech. He was just about writing the odd word, but they were random, and people were not clear on whether or not he was understanding very much. Although he seemed to recognise faces and those kind of things, and would laugh and would respond to banter, and that's basically, you know, what people knew. He wasn't eating very well either. They were retraining his swallow. But, you know, I spent a lot of time with Donovan talking about the speed that I'm talking at now, so relatively fast, explaining to him about the research and talking to him about it regularly, and each time I was going to do an observation, talk to him about that again. Now, just before I left, I went to him about the day before and said, I am exiting the field, I am leaving in a day or two, just wanted to let you know that, and, you know, it's been great and thank you for X, Y and Z. On the day that I left, they were having a party, and Donovan unusually was in a chair in the lounge, and as part of my kind of going around and saying goodbye, I went and said goodbye to him, and his mother was sat at the side, and he was in a big chair, a really comfy chair with big arms either side. And so I just knelt down by the side to him and I said, you know, it's been fantastic to meet you. You've made a massive contribution by letting me see what you're doing. I'm going to try and get back to you with findings when I've got them. This is where I think the research is going, and I had a chat with him and told him what was what. But now I've got to go. I've got to leave, and today's my last day, so I'm going to say goodbye. And he looked at me, and just as I stood up to go, like the flash of lightning, he put his hand on my hand, cupped his other hand over the top of my hand and gave me a big squeeze. And his mother cried, and I cried, and the reality we cried is not because I was freaking leaving, but because this action was the fastest action we'd seen. And so for me, it kind of meant there was something useful about his participation in a man that we didn't even think really was understanding very much at all, but I think clearly had understood his involvement in research and had understood what had been going on, and we were all in pieces. And of course, he's made other progress. And so what I've learned from him is that the power of involvement through any means possible was worth it. And this idea of involvement, and even, you know, gosh, who knows what he exactly thought? I have no idea, I'll never know. But there was a good sense that he knew that that was important to him, and that he had made a contribution. There was something that Jill said earlier about this notion of, that the MCA is based on individuals. Almost every participant I had participated because of their will to contribute to society, not for themselves, not one bit. And Donovan was the same. What I also learned from Donovan is that I was advised, really, how to interact with him. I was advised to joke. I was advised to build rapport because this is the person that he was. And I was told in a really clear way, and I was guided by people who knew him brilliantly. And then, of course, that, in terms of my access to data, was great, and that worked really well. So if you are working with people that you don't know, you know, like social workers were saying earlier, you know, actually you don't know, and who are you to know? Even if you've got, you know, assessment skills or whatever, there are people that know people better than you, and if you listen to that, it's probably going to go better. What maybe I've not given too much of a sense of is time. Each of my involvement with any of the 8 people who lacked capacity to consent, this took me weeks and weeks and weeks to get to a stage where I could begin anything with them. I had originally planned to do broad observations, close observations, and then interviews in that kind of order. And the reality was, interviews weren't that personal, and so I could get to those really early. Observations, and certainly close observations, happened right at the end, because it had taken all that time for people to kind of feel comfortable. And getting behind doors, even, you know, for staff purposes, let alone patients, took absolutely ages. So it took 2 months in each places to be able to start to do close observations. So it's a long, long time to get there. And of course, with anyone that you are consulting around personal consultation, you need to get their confidence as well. Because they, while they're consulting about what the person would have wanted, you know fully well if they don't think you're the right person or this is good research, they're not going to be saying, yeah, that's okay. They're in their own right a gatekeeper. So you have to be really clear and spend some time with consultees too. Okay. As I've been writing up my PhD, though, I guess there is a little bit of a touch of reality on some of this, some of which is around, there's a lot of work in ethnographic terms or in kind of qualitative terms, in terms of speech, for example. There's a lot of work for not so much data. So if I had set out purely around, say, involving people who lack capacity, or actually involving people with severe brain injury full stop, my data set would have been much smaller than probably what I needed to address my questions. And I think it was much smaller than I imagined it would be as well. I think I had hopeful expectations that I might be able to get more of what I got, and the reality is it took me an awful long time to get me what I got. I'm very pleased with what I got, but it was much smaller. As it happened, I was looking at triad relations, so I was looking at families and staff as well, so of course I got copious amounts of that. As a result, therefore, the PhD is weighted to that way. But I guess it's just a slight word of warning. Give yourself lots and lots of time and think about how much data you might need and what that data might look like and how you can use it and whether that will fit purposes. I think going through the ethics process, there's a notion of needing some motivation and certainly some resilience. When you're starting out in any study, facing that huge form when you're not quite sure is quite hard. It is quite hard work, and it's one of those administrative tasks that if you're really tired as well, you don't want to face. And I remember sort of logging on to IRAS thinking, oh, I don't want to go through this form again, especially when you're not quite sure what you're doing, but just keep going with it. Being organised and planning early is going to be absolutely critical, especially if you're thinking, well, your project will have a timescale, whatever project you may do. You've got to give yourself 8 months to a year minimum to get ethical approval. And it's 8 months if it goes well. And of course, you have to book these things all in advance and everything. So talk to people, get organised, plan. And I think if you're not a hybrid, or if you don't have some experience in the field, maybe that you're working in, then you'll need to give yourself even more time in the field. I think to build relations potentially, so it's just not necessarily, but just potentially is maybe worth a thought. But if I look back over the PhD and the process of gaining ethical approval, of course, it actually did all sorts of things for me. It made sure that I had a really solid research proposal before I got through it. I mean, it forces you to do that. You really have to know what you're doing. And maybe if you ask other PhD students who don't have to go through ethics in that way, they maybe know less about what they're doing at the stage that you do by the time you've gone through ethics process. So I think in that way it was hugely, hugely positive. I think it also gave me a project that was underpinned by some really strong ethical and moral principles, of which have carried through the project and will hopefully come out the other end and be actually useful. It also meant that I really had to get a shift on. And that's not a bad thing in a PhD either. I was able to therefore collect data at the end of my first year and into the second year, which then gave me a reasonable time for write-up. So that's another good thing, practically it pushes you on. And of course, the process, these processes and some of those musings led me to have an invitation from Jill to be able to write in this, which is quite frankly spectacular. So that was hugely positive. And so I think at times I did wonder when I was going through ethics process whether there was light at the end of the tunnel, but of course really, there wasn't much of a tunnel and it was mostly light. Thank you.